It does look very gruesome what's on the block for the 31st. The great question, though, swirling around in Parliament today was, will Liz Truss be there to see it, or will she have had to resign her position and trigger a contest of some kind? She's just, as you said, come away from the European Research Group, the right of centre, pro-Brexit group of Tory MPs. Quite a good reception there, I hear. But then she had quite a good reception at the One Nation group last night. What you shouldn't read into this is that these two groups are delighted with her overall performance and keen for her to lead them into the general election. The One Nation group is trying to wonder how on earth it could win a contest to succeed her, or have a candidate that they favoured to succeed her, given if it's restricted to MPs, as many MPs want. And the One Nation group, you sense, talking to some MPs in that wing of the party, that you really are looking at an impending battle for the soul of the party. They see an opportunity to wrestle back a party which they feel this other wing has had for too long in its grasp. But they don't want to hit the button triggering a contest until they have a pretty good idea of what the result will be. Who will walk through that door replacing Liz Truss? And the names you hear on that front, well, of course, Rishi Sunak, the man who challenged Liz Truss this summer, but he's got quite a few enemies in the House of Commons. I had quite a few Tory MPs say to me, tell you what would be a great idea, a dream ticket, Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. Sometimes your jaw is on the ground when you're having these conversations. Penny Mordaunt gets talked about, of course, she was in the contest last time round, and then Theresa May gets talked about. But none of them are sure that they could actually finesse one of these coronations, so you may have a contest. What comes out of a contest is unpredictable. So at the moment, Liz Truss goes into these meetings and gets a reasonably good reception, probably a much trickier encounter at Prime Minister's questions tomorrow. But it does look for the moment as though, barring some surprise, she survives into tomorrow and probably the day after. But you wouldn't want to call it too much further than that.
Yesterday's power switch in Downing Street seemed to soothe the markets today. The Chancellor warned ministers at Cabinet that they would have to find spending cuts across departments.
Is it time for Liz Truss to go?
Number 10 later clarified those cuts could include abandoning the triple lock on pensions, the guarantee that they rise by earnings, inflation or 2.5%, whichever is highest. After Cabinet, a suspect package shut down Whitehall and there was a controlled explosion. Although pensions could be hit by spending cuts, Number 10 signalled that the commitment to raise defence spending to 3% of GDP by the end of the decade would remain intact.
In my first few days in the job...
After yesterday's uncomfortable outing, sitting next to Jeremy Hunt as he ripped up most of her mini-budget, rival camps in Parliament are trying to work out when is the best time to move against Liz Truss to make sure their preferred candidate gets the top job.
An awful lot of your colleagues across the Rubicon decided Liz Truss's time is up, but they just don't want to press the button yet because they're not sure what would follow.
Well, I think the key thing for us to be seen as to try and regain our reputation of competence is to make sure that when we do press that button, or if we do press that button, we're clear about where we're going, we're clear about why we're doing it, and we're clear that the new person will have an appeal to the country.
Hand on heart, there's not really an if about it, is there?
Well, let's wait and see.
Look, you can talk to 12 people and they've had 14 conversations. There's a hell of a lot that is going on. If there's to be a change, and there is still a huge if there is to be a change, how is it best delivered as speedily and seamlessly as possible? Have some sort of coronation where somebody emerges, possibly in a sort of triumvirate or quad situation where they say, look,
a dream ticket.
The three of us are standing, four of us are standing. These are the positions that each person would have.
Agreeing a new candidate to succeed Liz Truss with no contest looks challenging in a deeply divided party. Many MPs are determined to find a way to keep party members who voted Liz Truss in out of the next leadership contest. Today, though, a poll suggested even they have turned against her. An opinion poll of Conservative Party members conducted over the last couple of days suggested that 55% of them thought Liz Truss should resign as Prime Minister. 83% thought she was doing a bad job. Anger about Liz Truss's policy swerves spilled into the Welsh Senedd today after the leader of the Welsh Conservatives criticised the Welsh NHS.
It is absolutely shocking to me that you think that you can turn up here this afternoon with a mess that your party has made to the budget of this country, to the reputation of this country around the world, that you promise those people that there will be more to come, and you think you turn up here this afternoon and claim some sort of moral high ground? What sort of world do you belong in?
Tomorrow, after a day away from the cameras, Liz Truss must defend her government at Prime Minister's questions. The Guardian reported that her former cabinet colleague Michael Gove today suggested the Labour leader might like to start with a one-word question. Why?
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, the Chancellor is promising us more eye-watering decisions on government spending and taxes as part of his mission to get the public finances back on track. Our economics reporter Neil MacDonald is here. What's he planning?
Well, it's an enormous challenge for him despite everything that he did yesterday. So his plan is to get government debts falling as a share of our national income. But because of the loss of confidence on financial markets, there's a sense that he may have to show he can do that and a bit more to just show he's got room to spare. So yesterday he scrapped £32 billion of the tax cuts. It's thought he needs to find another 30 billion of savings to achieve his plan. Some economists are talking about trying to save 50 billion because that way he can confidently say to financial markets, you can trust me, I'm going to get debt under control. I've even built in a little bit of wiggle room for myself. If he does go that way, the problem is there's got to be bigger cuts somewhere else now.
And these are crazy numbers, Neil. What does it mean for public spending, for instance?
Well, it looks like a very big squeeze, and obviously easy savings are going to be very hard to find, and that's obvious the moment you look at the figures, exactly the same figures that I'm sure he's looking at right now. So next year, the government is planning to spend over £1 trillion. That is a huge number, but it doesn't mean it's easy to cut into. About a fifth of that goes on defence and on health, about a quarter goes on welfare spending, pensions and benefits, and we'll probably spend about 100 billion just paying the interest on our existing borrowings. So do you cut into the areas that you're committed to protecting, like health? Do you hit benefits, which immediately affects people's living standards, or do you just squeeze everything else that's left? The problem is that the everything else that is left is schools, police, prisons. These are all areas that have already had a very tough squeeze for the last decade.
And what is the alternative to this dismal picture?
Well, if you think all of that sounds politically undeliverable, how about we turn to tax increases? So if we put, for example, VAT up from 20%, where it is now, to 22.5%, that would, at a stroke, raise £19 billion for you, make a huge dent in those savings we were talking about. The problem, of course, is obvious. VAT is a tax that immediately affects consumers and would, of course, push up inflation precisely at the point that the government wants to bring inflation under control.
Neil MacDonald, thanks very much, as ever. Well, we're joined now by Tobias Ellwood, Chair of the Defence Select Committee and, of course, Conservative Member of Parliament for Bournemouth East. Thanks for coming back on the programme. It is quite astonishing when one stands back to consider that we used to get torrents of boosterism coming out of the building behind me. Now we've got, Nordic depression. And it's mainly because of what this government has done in the last 4 weeks. You can understand why everyone, including Tory MPs, is deeply, deeply upset.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. It's been an experiment we've conducted with the economy, and it's not gone well. And there's a recognition that we now need to reboot. We need to reset. We need to regroup. And we're starting to do that. There's certainly a calmer Westminster today than there has been in the last few days, indeed weeks or so, as we've got back to understanding what the Conservatives usually do well, which is offer fiscal responsibility. And we're seeing that with Jeremy Hunt, the new Chancellor, producing his economic plan. He's only halfway there. We know that there is still a huge black hole to fill. Those numbers will be produced on the 31st of October. I certainly hope that the recognition that we need to reset doesn't stay with the economics, but moves into the politics as well. We need to.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But why should your party be given another chance, frankly? You know, you've changed Prime Minister once, you're going to probably do it again. I mean, enough is enough. It's time to go back to the country, surely.
Well, you make an interesting argument. The mechanics in which we chose our leader, I think, is the core problem that we ended up where we are today. If you only ask our membership which direction they want to go, you're going to get particular answers. And what was clear is that growth productivity has been a problem in the UK going back to 2008. And Liz Truss presented a package of measures which clearly were too radical. They didn't include an understanding of the international headwinds, and it's led to a massive reset, as we've seen now. But the markets have stabilized. We've seen the pound strengthen. We've seen interest rates come down. But yeah, we've got to put our hand up and say it's been very, very difficult indeed. We shouldn't have been there in the first place. We shouldn't have been there in the first place. But we have been there because of what your government's done. Let me ask you this, Tobias Ellwood. What we're hearing from Downing Street is that they're actually still relatively wedded, hard to believe, but they are, to the 3% of GDP spending on defence, which is something that you care deeply about, but they are contemplating ditching the triple lock on pensions. Is it now more important for this government to stand up to Beijing than to stand with pensioners? I think you've absolutely oversimplified the situation. I make it very clear from where I stand, and it's my job to do so, that there is a symbiotic relationship between our economy and our prosperity and our security. If we don't look after our interests nationally and internationally, our economy suffers, arguably more than most because we've embraced globalization, which is now on the decline. The world is getting more dangerous, not less, and we need to stand up to those aggressors. We see what's going on in Ukraine. I don't believe we've done enough. You know, the price of food has gone up internationally and is affecting inflation here because those ships can't get out of Odessa. Oil and gas prices have gone up because of insecurity in Eastern Europe. If we'd lent into that area more, then it would actually impact on international inflation. We've not done so, and then that's the consequences. So I make it really clear why it's important that Britain, of all countries, does spend its 3% on GDP.
All right, but that, you know, that may not survive the 31st of October. Let me ask you this. The woman who resides in the building behind me has been stripped of everything that she promised to do in this country. She is the ghost prime minister, as the Sun newspaper put it this morning. So at the moment, what is the point of Liz Truss?
Well, you offer all sorts of questions about what you would do to replace her. Now, what we've learned the hard way is that we need to make sure that the markets are on our side. The markets see predictability and stability. And as I just said, we're waiting for the next layer of information to come from Jeremy Hunt on the 31st of October. I don't agree that suddenly triggering some form of leadership contest, given the pain that we've just gone through, is what the markets want to see. More political instability will be the equivalent of more economic instability. And this isn't what we want right now.
Okay.
You touch on the 3% GDP.
Right, earlier this summer, it's a slightly different subject, but earlier this summer you got into a lot of trouble with your party for suggesting that one way to get around our economic issues would be to rejoin the European single market. You were put into purdah for several months as a result of that. Has that idea now come? I mean, is this now something that we should be contemplating?
Well, you touch on a very, very toxic issue within the Conservative Party, and I think what we need to do is recognise what is in Britain's best interest. What is clear is that the economic model that we currently have for Brexit isn't working as efficiently as it should. I offered the suggestion that we reconsider. I went down to the engine room. I looked at how successful that model is, and it isn't working correctly. There's no argument to return to the EU, but there are different models of Brexit that we now need to pursue. But I'm afraid because of Boris Johnson, nobody was willing to touch that. But we're now seeing a refreshing, I think, greater relationship with the EU. We saw that with the Northern Ireland Protocol, with the discussions that's taking place there. So who knows? I hope that could possibly lead to us actually developing an economic partnership with the EU that would allow 4% GDP. That's the cost of our Brexit at the moment, to us to be reconsidered. But I make it very clear, this is a very sensitive issue for the Conservative Party.
And it was for you, and we've got to leave it there, but I take that as a gentle flirtation with the single market again. Tobias Elwood, thank you very much indeed. Well, earlier I spoke to the TUC General Secretary, Frances O'Grady, and I began by putting it to her that Jeremy Hunt simply had no choice but to act to placate the markets.
Of course he has a choice. The real question here is who's going to pay for the mess that the Conservative Party has caused in government. And, you know, he could introduce a far bigger windfall tax on energy giants. He could ensure that capital gains tax and income tax were equalised. He could look at making sure that those big businesses and wealthy individuals who have more money contribute a fair share. But what I think he can't do is keep coming back, hitting wage packets and expecting people to suck it up, because I think it's got to the stage now where working families just don't have any more fat left to trim, and but they can't keep on coming for more.
Right, but even if he were to raise those taxes that you've just mentioned, that's not going to fill the hole that needs to be filled.
Well, I think some of the taxes that the TUC have proposed would ensure that nurses and other public service workers got a decent pay increase this year, because, you know, the government promised levelling up. What we're seeing is levelling down, and frankly, they don't have a mandate to hit our public services and those who work for them time and time again. I think we need a real plan for growth, and that's what was missing from the government's plan and is still missing.
But if you don't placate the markets, which is something that we've learned, you know, brutally in the last few weeks, if you don't placate the markets will hammer you. And that applies to, you know, a Labour government as well as a Tory government.
The markets hammered this Conservative government because there was no scrutiny, no costings and no real plan for growth. That's why the markets hammered Liz Truss's plan, and she's still in Downing Street apparently. But you know, what we need is a real plan for growth that's about creating good, high-skilled, greener jobs in the parts of the country that need them most, but also making sure that everybody pays their fair share. And the reality is that, you know, this government is still lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses at a time when it's driving down nurses' pay. It's just not right.
So at the moment, it's about stopping the bleeding, and some of the bleeding has stopped. But we're also facing what could be a wave of industrial unrest in what could be a winter of discontent. What do you say, you know, to nurses and teachers who are preparing to strike?
The TUC is right behind working people who are saying enough is enough. Nobody wants to go on strike. What unions want are fair agreements, fair deals that give workers a decent pay rise so they can raise their families. But of course, people are sticking with each other now because they can see that, you know, their wage packets are being treated like cash tills. It's not fair. It's not right.
Would you welcome a wave of industrial
unrest? These key workers as heroes.
Right. Would you welcome a wave of industrial unrest in order to bring those wage packets up to where you think they should be?
We want to see fair agreements, and even now government could get around the table with public servants and come to a deal. But if the government won't listen or won't compromise, then of course workers have no choice but to stand up for themselves. That's what they're doing in ballots up and down the country now. None of us wanted to be here, but what else can working people do? It can't be right that we've got hospitals opening up food banks to provide for their staff. Everybody knows this is wrong, and workers are right to stand up and defend themselves against real pay cuts.
Frances O'Grady, thank you very much.